3 minutes past 10 p.m. Thankfully, my voice seems mostly back to normal. It's of the world, like countries and nation states, interact with each other as well. And we're going to look at that through the lens of various current events and historical events that are going on. And I would like your input as well, of course. When we go into this, I would love to know if you have any events that you would like to bring up regarding current events, or if you're a history buff and you'd like to talk about historical events. I would love to hear about your thoughts regarding certain events that you'd like to bring up, and I will link them back to this topic as well in how we understand the world and how it works and how people operate inside of it. For now, though, make sure that you have a drink in your hand. Make sure that you're being kind to yourself and sit back and enjoy. Make sure that you've brought a thinking cap so that we can have good discussions. And of course, if you'd like to have a more vocal discussion and you'd like to chat in person, feel free to come into voice chat. This may not be a full 2-hour stream. I'm not sure how much I have in the tank. Today was a pretty rough day in terms of energy. Like, I didn't feel like I was very awake today. I took a nap and it didn't really help. I feel kind of I feel a bit deflated. I'm not really sure why, but I guess we sort of keep going. In these kinds of days, I think it's I try to take it easy, but it's really difficult to kind of it's very difficult to get that out. It's really difficult to commit to that sort of thing because I have a lot of writing to do that I'm currently working on and other things like that. So it's difficult to relax, but I've been doing my best. Thank you. Oh God, I forgot to flip off. I forgot to flip over the rest of my my divider. Explains. Yeah. There you go. In the darkness, you don't really see it. Tomorrow, at least I have stuff to do. Like, tomorrow I can't even clean the house. Usually Sunday's the cleaning day, but tomorrow we have, I have my friend's wedding to go to that I'm singing at, which is very exciting. And then we have a little get-together afterwards, and then when I come home I have my Star Wars tabletop session. So I'm pretty packed tomorrow, I have to say. I'd love to know how you guys are doing regarding mental health, physical health. Please let me know what you're doing out of 10. And let me know how your day's been going. I'd love to hear about it. We'll chill first before we really head into the nitty-gritty of everything. I've been kind of looking for various articles that I could use regarding the actions of countries and things like that. I think I'll sort of, I don't have like fancy graphics and stuff, you know. I'm more of a chilled, we just chat, and if we need a source, I'll look it up. Oh goodness. But yeah, the way that... Ooh, you know what? Maybe there's a good... Let's have a look, like... Oh, yeah, interesting. I'm looking at, like, a world map, and I'm wondering if, like... Oh, sorry, this map is very funny. It's got, like, yeah, you know what? This is a good map. This is a good map to start with, I think. I'm not sure how, like, fully accurate it is, but it's accurate enough that I think I'll talk about it. Got some sleep and now head hurty, but otherwise doing okay-ish. Yeah, that's because That's because you stayed up for too long before. You are head hurty because of you. Not been up to much today. Mostly just watched a nice BBC political espionage drama. Oh, cool. Now transcribing some Murray Gold. Nice, nice. Very cool. Yeah, what political espionage drama are you watching? Behind me, there's still a market going on. The whole street was turned into like a no-go zone for cars, and they're just having a fair with like restaurants and stuff. Oh no, if it isn't the consequences of my own action. Precisely. Oh god, excuse me. Okay. I think today, usually Saturdays are like our most populated streams. I'm noticing a steady decline, and I'm wondering about it. If you don't, if you wanted to catch up on the morning stream, we looked at some tabletop stuff. And we did a D&D draft pick, which was quite fun. So that was quite cool. Night Sleeper. A terror group takes control of an overnight train, and there's still passengers on board working with the cybersecurity team to figure out how to stop it. Cool. Okay. So why? What is the terror group there for? What are they there to do? Why do they take control of the train? What is their purpose? Or is it more reliant on the idea that these are the bad guys, which is quite appropriate for what we're going to be talking about today. All right, I think I'll let me see if I can. I've got this map here that I've been looking at, and I'm interested. I'm kind of sad that this map does not mention bricks at all, which is a little bit disappointing because of how important it is. Apparently the sort of the labels don't mention bricks, which is kind of, yeah, it's a little surprising. Anyway, we're gonna talk about it either way, but yeah. They're still revealing details, but the group's MO is about protesting UK's involvement in Middle Eastern affairs going back to 2001. Sounds like something fairly relevant to today. Yeah, makes sense. Of course, those people are then positioned as the bad guys. I don't know if it is. Like, are they positioned as definitely bad guys who need to be, like, killed with extreme prejudice? Okay. Still looking at some of the news that we've done as well. Okay. Today we're going to look at a little bit... we're going to look at things on a little bit more of a global scale. Okay. I think I'll wait for Alex's last reply, and then we can get into it. Like I said, if you have any events or historical or regular that you'd like to talk about, please let me know. They're not really objectively defined what we think of the group. They're more focused on the train than the people behind it story-wise. Okay, cool. All right. Well, I hope you enjoy that. Did you finish it? Did you finish watching it? Yeah. Anyway, while you reply to that, yeah, we're gonna talk about this is interesting. What's this country? Oh, it's the other side of the map. Whoops. It's a globe. My bad. So, let's have a chat. We're going a bit more global with the discussion. When I was younger, and I mean in school, we learned quite a lot about global events. Things like the way that World War II was fought and everything that came up after that. We learned about a lot of American history. We learned obviously a lot about South African history. We didn't learn much about the full history of Africa, but we did learn about 3 of the main major African civilizations in the southern African area, like Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe. I can't remember the other one. But yeah, when we learned about this, hi Saber, welcome. When I learned about when I learned about like geopolitics or global events and global alliances and things like that in high school, I wasn't fully aware of even the fact that I live down here, which is super interesting because, hang on, where is it? Yeah, I live down here, which is super interesting because it's shown as an Eastern Allied country, and it is shown to be a part of BRICS. And yet, at the same time, the amount of American-centered history that we learned was pretty crazy. It wasn't more than, our own history that we learned. We did learn our own history quite well. But there was a pretty interesting amount of American history that we learned compared to other history. Like, for example, we did learn also about, like, when we did the Cold War, for example, we did a healthy amount of American history and a healthy amount of Russian history. But for example, we did the civil rights movement in America, for example, and we did the Russian Revolution in Russia, and we did all the implications that came about from that. And when I was a kid, obviously, you don't really, with no sources to the contrary, you don't really question any of the angles that your history is teaching if there's nothing that immediately makes your antenna stand on end. But I remember we did almost no history from an entire continent of the world, being Southern America. I don't think we did any history there. We didn't do any history of Australia. We didn't do any history of India, and we did precious little UK history. I think our UK history was really mostly related to their relation to America and their relation to us as colonizers. We did a fair amount of Russian history, but it wasn't nearly as much as let's say America. We didn't do any Chinese, Korean, Japanese history. We went into a little bit of Europe. It was a pretty good chunk though. And obviously we did World War I and World War II. And I've realized now as I grow that, or as I went to university, and then I started to realize that my history was taught mostly from within the relation to all of these blue countries, America, the UK, Europe, etc. And not all of them, obviously. Like, I don't know about Canada or Greenland's history or whatever, but mostly it was America and the UK and their relation to a lot of other countries. And as I started to wonder why that was, I started to open my eyes more to how inter-country relations really work. And then I was very thankful that when I was in high school, I was taught about the Cold War, and I was taught about how it was a so-called war of ideologies, and when America so-called won the Cold War, that was their chance to spread their ideology all over the world. And of course, now we live under, that system of global capitalism. And when as I grew older through my university years, I started realizing that was it was so much more prevalent than I realized. That spread of the kind of history that only certain parts of the world encourage you to learn about. Certain parts of the history that are seen as more prominent and more extreme, more important than any other parts of the world. And the older I get, the more I find that importance is truly subjective. So why am I talking about all of this? Because the point today is to understand the idea of good and bad, for me to kind of share the learning that I've done over the last however many years of both my class consciousness and my like international awareness, my self-awareness, and politically what I view as definitions of good and bad. What I'd like for you to do with me today, if you haven't done so already, and I feel like lots of you have done this already, is figure out what you understand to be good and bad. When you think of a country that is good, if you could think of one off the dome, when you think about a country that is bad, can you think about that off the dome? Can you think about countries that, rather than you personally think are good or bad, can you think about countries that you have been told are good or bad from your history class and things like that? I can tell you, when I was in South Africa, I was still taught, despite the fact that South Africa is an ally economically of countries like Russia, China, etc., part of the BRICS coalition with Brazil and things like that, India too. You know, I remember when I think of countries that I would consider bad, in my schooling, Russia, China, Brazil, all of those countries still came to mind. And then, of course, don't forget the Middle East, which, as I said last political education stream, we have clumped together, not as these independent sovereign states, but in fact, just this big deserty mess that is always full of conflict and war. That is how the West sees the Middle East, very much so. And so, when we learn about what constitutes good and bad, there's definitely a skew, and this may seem obvious to you, but it's still important to talk about. So, when I say good and bad, the point of this stream, the point of this discussion, is for you to unpack what that means to you. And hopefully by the end, or at least maybe now you're already here with me and we share this opinion, is that I have completely deconstructed the idea of good and bad. The main thesis of this stream, the main thesis of the discussion, is that I don't believe in countries and nation states as being good or bad. I believe in countries and nation states as advancing whatever agenda they wish to do. That doesn't mean that they're all bad. That's what I mean. I mean, like, good and bad is irrelevant. People are good. People do good things and bad things. Countries as a whole are made up of people who do good and bad things. Countries should not be personified. I believe that would be a huge mistake. To view countries as good countries and bad countries is a very convenient way of looking at the world. It's very easy, but in my opinion, it's very lazy. And it does not give the people who live in those countries an adequate chance to really share their stories, which are as diverse as any other country. And as I've grown older, I've really come to understand that. It's very easy to take in what is given to you through your environment, through advertisements and movies and TV and books and all media that we consume. And in so many subtle ways, right from your history textbook that may give a slightly biased version of history, all the way to a movie you see where you will literally see a person with a wrapping around their head in a desert background, and you will think that's a bad guy. And it is crazy how much we in the West have been conditioned to think that way. So this is going to be a little bit of reconstruction. We're going to jump around on a couple of topics. So I'm probably gonna find it very difficult to stick to one, but as we go through, I'm gonna use this map to talk about various countries and where they've stood in history, and hopefully I will be able to deconstruct the idea of good and bad for you. So that's the basic kind of introduction and thesis of this stream. When I was a boy, I killed my father with a hammer. I find it wild that you weren't taught your own history in relation to the countries around you, but rather through the UK, US, etc. That's wild. I'll rephrase. I was taught my own history purely, but South African history is so rich with UK colonization and then Dutch colonization that we can't extract it. It can't be extracted from that. So there really was a link to that for sure. Yeah. We were not given. I don't believe that I was ever given in high school, a South African version of history from the perspective of Africans. I was given a perspective of history from the settlers and what happened there. It's not that I don't think my teacher ever said that the settlers were like, good guys, but I think, but I don't think it was as heavy on the fact that, these were awful, evil acts that were done to the indigenous people. And I don't think that was fully grappled with in my high school. In university, it was much better understood. And Southwest Asia, North Africa, Middle East are mostly only in conflict with each other because of Western meddling. Yeah, we'll talk about that as well, for sure. So, Brazil is also in that group, yes. BRICS, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Those are the countries that are in the BRICS coalition. But very recently, South Africa, the BRICS came together and added a bunch of new countries that wanted to join. So they are making quite an interesting coalition. I disagree on people being good or bad. So would I. I did correct, yeah. Although you corrected yourself to action, so I don't know if it's sentiment you were trying to express. No. Yeah, let me be clear. I corrected myself for a reason. Good or bad, I believe in deconstructing the very idea of good or bad as a whole descriptor of someone or something entirely. I don't like it. I think it's lazy. I think it's polarizing and divisive. I would prefer to view actions as having certain consequences. This is the action, this is the consequence. Whether that brings pain or joy, whether that is something that leads to happiness or sadness, that is what I determine is good or bad. But even then, I don't like to use the words good and bad when I'm having serious discussions. When I'm having casual discussions, when I need a blanket statement, good or bad seems, it is an appropriate way, it's an appropriate word to use in that context. But most of the time, when we go into detailed discussions, I try to stray away from those words when I define people. I don't think that people are good or bad. I think we are people, and we do things that have consequences that are good or bad, You beat me to it. I try not to think of entire states as good or bad. It's obviously fairly easy to jump to a couple examples could be perceived as inherently bad, but so much more complex than that. Nothing is inherently bad. Even the worst thing that you could possibly think of in the world right now is not inherently good or bad. There is always nuance. I will say that there are exceptions. Like, for example, and bearing in mind that we shouldn't deconstruct so extremely to the point that we forget to call things as we see them. So when something is objectively true, for example, the colonization of many of almost all of the nations all around the third world now, the colonization of America, colonization of South Africa, I feel very comfortable in saying that was an awful, bad, and terrible thing that had way more negative and devastating consequences for entire civilizations, for billions of people. It is still having consequences today. I don't think I will ever think anything good of something like colonization, for example. Even though there's nuance to be had within the discussion of colonization, on the whole, you'll never find me going, there were some good things about it, that's not productive to me. That's not productive at all. It's important to look through the discussion while not forgetting the kind of essence of the discussion that you're having. So if you are going to discuss something like colonization, you first have to say right off the bat, like, you have to remember in your mind that, we're dealing with a topic that, still affects us today, a topic that lasted centuries, maybe even more than that, a topic that has, displaced and adversely affected, like I said, billions of people. And so, yeah, the taking something like good and bad away from the actions of countries and groups of people is only really done for the purposes of understanding why countries do things. Because remember, when I think of I think it's too reductionist. When I think of, since we're talking about the topic of colonization, let's talk about the UK and their spread, or mainly like Western Europe and its spread all around, because it includes Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, etc. When that level of colonization spread, it's very easy to think, why? Why did it spread? And you could come to the reason that, these are just bad countries. They did that. But no, that's reductionist. The truth about why colonization spread is there are reasons that you can go into, and that is way more helpful in understanding, for example, the divine right of kings and the divine right of conquest. These were religiously informed doctrines that were handed down from the Pope at the time, who was viewed as literally chosen by God, to then hand down decrees to the monarchs of the various countries, saying that they were not only permitted to go into other countries and exterminate anyone they could find or convert them to their religion, but in fact they were encouraged to do so. It wasn't just, okay, fine, you can do it. It was, please go do it. This is your holy duty. So it's way more than saying like it was just a bad thing. You need to understand how bad, like what kind of bad was it, Yeah, so that's what I mean. When I say deconstructing ideas of good and bad, I mean to not be reductionist about it. I mean to go into the nuance of the conversation. When you retrieve to terms like good or bad for these things, you concede that what happened was inevitable and just in their nature. That's a wonderful point. I have heard so many people, historians as well, historians will look at earlier events and tell you that because either they will say it outright, or they, particularly when it comes to things like war, they will say outright that certain events inevitably led to war. World War II is a great example of that. And as you get older, I would really hope that all of you come to the conclusion when you hear something like that, that is, no, it wasn't inevitable. People made choices. Countries acted on agendas, but those agendas could have changed. People made choices that had consequences. At any point in that time, someone could have turned around and made a different choice, and we would be in a completely different position, maybe. Maybe it would have changed nothing, but we'll never know. The point is that it's so easy to look back on certain events and see them as inevitable. But the inevitability of historical events is no more so than it is today. We are just living through those choices right now, rather than people who have already lived through those choices and, been and gone in historical events. So no, absolutely, Arachizi, it's not inevitable. There's nothing about nature here that we can talk about that is productive. It's a lazy argument, in my opinion, because it takes away all of the agency that we purport to have in ourselves as human beings. I cannot confidently say that historical events were ever inevitable, except when it came to natural disasters, because those are not things that we have control over. Acts of God, so to speak, like the legal term. So yeah, and especially historians will love to talk about this in terms of conflict. They'll be like let's talk about, we can zoom into the Middle East for a second. We can talk about how in the Middle East, there's so much going on here. Oh God, that's a big zoom. There's so much going on here. Look how tiny Israel is. It's pretty crazy. There's so much going on here that it's like, this is just it's a giant conflict zone. It's inevitable that there's just going to be fighting. And I'm like, no, it's not. People are making choices. By saying it is inevitable that conflict in the Middle East will continue no matter what, you are not only reducing the agency of people down to one, like countries full of people that are all independent, down to just a whole region of a formless blob. But you are also limiting the capabilities of those people in your mind. It lends itself to viewing people as being less than. When you see someone and you say that their actions are inevitable, what you really mean is that person does not have enough agency to do anything except act on instinct. But you do, because you're a person, right? You have control over yourself, and so you immediately put an us versus them. You put a hierarchy in place. And so when you say things like, good and bad is when you say things like these things are inevitable because these people are bad, these people are good, you are immediately aligning yourself with good. And because we don't think of ourselves as like that. We don't think of ourselves as not having autonomy. We want autonomy. Only there are some people who believe in determinism, but I guarantee you there are a lot of people who don't. And I'm certainly one of them. You have to have to go further than just, they did it, it was inevitable, it's fine. Especially regarding historical events. We like to think of history as being a completely separate event from what's going on now. But where do you draw the line? What is history? Is history yesterday? Is history 100 years ago? Is history 50 years ago? No. The answer is no. History is right now. As it happens, we make history for people after us. We must think beyond what is happening now. We must understand that history is an evolving thing up to today. We feel the effects of history. And those were not inevitable choices. War should never be inevitable. People just choose to ignore that there is a peaceful solution because war is what tends to happen when powers follow a path that is easy for them to remain on. That's a great point. And then it's easier for them to say, it was inevitable, than to take accountability for them to say that they chose to ignore a more difficult path that would be peaceful. Absolutely. War happened. Correct. So yeah, there is also the idea of accountability. A lot of people, when we talk about, I'll tell you one thing. This country here, this is Korea, that's North Korea, this is Japan. This country here, when the United States of America, I cannot tell you how many times I have heard, both from people who were just making casual conversation and from my actual history class. I will say this was taught specifically in my history class, that what the United States of America did to Japan by hitting them with 2 nuclear weapons on civilian targets was inevitable. I can't count the number of times I've heard that. And when I hear it now, it short circuits my brain. I don't know how you can confidently say that an action like nuclear war is inevitable. Like, do you just not believe in choice? Are you a determinist? I don't know. It feels a bit weird, right? Now, obviously, I'm not thinking of, this is not like a personal attack on you if you are someone who's believed this. I'm asking you to question that. I'm asking you to dig a little deeper when you say that something is inevitable. Part of that inevitability, as Saber has said, is taking accountability away from what you've done. And the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, on civilian targets, by the United States of America, was an action that they took. And it was not the only action that they had available to them. What were all the actions? I don't know. But I can guarantee you that nuclear war was not the only option. They made a choice. In fact, several choices along the line. At any point, they could have stopped the Manhattan Project. They could have pulled the plug. They could have not pressed the button. There were so many opportunities to turn back, and they didn't. They continued forward. Those were choices. They were not inevitabilities. They took the easiest path because, for many other reasons, but one of them was it was easier to press the button on people that were far away and people that you could see as the enemy. Remember, this region of the world, all the way on the other side of the world, it just kind of, let's go there. All the way on the other side of the world to the United States of America. When after the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States of America started rounding up Japanese American citizens. Not even like illegal immigrants or anything. Citizens. People who were born here that had Japanese heritage. And they put them in detention camps. This is around the time that World War II was happening. So we already had detention camps across the sea in Europe based on what Nazi Germany was doing. But here you have America, the good guy of the world, putting Japanese American citizens in internment camps, in detention camps. And so began a decade-long string of propaganda against Japanese people because they needed to justify attacking Japan to the fullest extent of their capabilities. The people of America needed to be on board. How did they get on board? By running that propaganda machine, by constantly drumming into them through the consumption of our media that these people are all criminals, they're all bad, they look like this, they smell like this, they talk like this. That is why thinking in terms of good and bad is so dangerous. Look further. Looking further allows you to see that the good guys and the bad guys is so often, when it comes to countries, just a point of view. And finding the truth is way more difficult, but it's way more worth it. I keep forgetting how small Israel is, and by extension, how tiny Palestine is. Gaza's like 3 pixels here, and the West Bank is a blob. Yeah. I mean, obviously, Palestine used to be like the whole thing. But yeah. So, I will talk again about some contradictions that we've had. I'm gonna go over to this country. Why is there this in the middle of the the aforementioned blob of so-called desert countries full of brown people that are constantly at war, as so many media outlets in the West would like us to believe? Why is there this giant blue country? This tiny blue country we have talked about many times, so I won't talk about it much again this time. But why this country? Well, this country is Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't know how many times you've heard in, again, the media we consume, the books we read, the TV we watch, the movies we watch, about Saudi Arabia. I don't know how many times you've heard in news outlets what happens to, let's say, women in Saudi Arabia, the rights of women, the fundamentalist regime ruling Saudi Arabia right now, the existence of like religious countries, the painting of Saudi Arabia as a backwards, bad nation full of bad people. They treat their women terribly, quote unquote, etc., etc. Now, regardless of whether any of that is true or not, if it was true, if all of that stuff really was meant to make us hate them that much, why are they blue? Why are they allied with all of these countries that are saying such bad things about them? Why? What is the reason? It's a 3-letter word. It's just oil. It's resources. Saudi Arabia is sitting on one of the biggest oil reserves on the planet. They have an incredible wealth beneath them. And because oil funds all of our fossil fuel industries, which under global capitalism is the driving force of energy behind the worlds, behind these countries, it doesn't matter what morals they have. This is why good and bad are irrelevant. This is why we are talking about this. When it comes to countries, it doesn't matter who's good or bad. When it comes to what nation states are doing, the concept of a nation state under the current global order is is a transfers of power, transfers of resources. In the United States of America's case, it is whoever has resources to give them, whoever is willing to engage in capitalism, whoever is willing to fight any enemies of capitalism, all of that. So yeah, Saudi Arabia could be, as the media tells us, a bad country full of bad people. And yet, why are we trading with them? I'll give you another one, Russia. Now, of course, Russia is in the red. But let me tell you one thing that's really fun, is that when the Ukraine-Russian war broke out, when Russia invaded Ukraine and that war started, do you know how much the rest of Europe like almost came to a standstill? Because what Russia has done is, despite the fact that the West has run a decades-long propaganda machine against Russia, on the side, they are also their biggest gas trading partner. Russia supplies a ridiculous percentage of gas to the entirety of Europe, while also being one of the bad guys of the world. It doesn't make sense. What's happening? It's transfer of resources, transfer of power. It's not about morals. It's not about ethics. As much as people would have you believe, it's not about morals. The truth is deeper than that. You can find moral good. You can find morals, but they are not in what countries are doing to each other. They are not in international relations. And this is one of the worst things to find, because you can end up being so cynical about the whole thing, but there is still more to do. This deconstruction is only the first step. Hello, Rain. Welcome. Thank you for vibing. That story is so disgusting. What story? The Japanese ones? Yeah. What America did to its Japanese citizens, it was insane. It was absolutely insane. The only thing that was inevitable was Neo and Mr. Smith fighting each other in the Matrix. Bro, I'm American. I don't think any of my history classes ever actually told me that. Yeah. It's wild to me that anyone believes that dropping the atom bombs was inevitable. That is the prevailing common belief, Saber, in the West. It is this number one reason. The number one reason you will hear for World War II is the Japanese Imperial Army refused to surrender, leaving the United States no choice but to nuke their two biggest civilian cities. That's it. That's the reason they give. No choice. It's insane. It's insanity. It's absolutely insane. But of course, your history classes will not teach you this stuff. Because why? Why would they? Why would they teach you stuff that would make you understand what they're really doing? They would rather teach you what they want to. I also heard it was to make the war finish earlier, and no, it wasn't, and it wasn't successful in that regard. Yeah, there was more. There was still more fighting. And even if it was to make the war finish earlier, how does that justify doing that? You know? How does that justify anything? There is no justification in my mind. Yeah, it's always oil, and the gas trade is still going. Yeah, absolutely. Russia is still trading gas with the rest of Europe, and yet the rest of Europe is stand with Ukraine, etc., etc. Meanwhile, they're still trading with Russia because they can't stop. They rely too much on it because Russia has made itself an indispensable gas trading partner, and so the resource trade continues. So we have Saudi Arabia, we have Russia. We got lots of other countries. We have China as a giant trading partner to so many places, and yet it's still considered communist for some reason, even though it's not. And all of these places are marketed to us as terrible, and yet here we are still doing seemingly hypocritical things with those places, and that is something that you should use in your deconstruction efforts. We're still seeing the effects of the sanctions on Russian oil. In the UK specifically, the oil prices have been rising and rising for 3 years. They've only went down twice in 3 years. Yeah, went up another 10% 26 days ago. That's crazy. I can't remember what the film said about what he thought leading up to the drop, but didn't Oppenheimer deeply regret what he'd led the creation of to his death? I'm not too sure about it. I mean, he has that famous quote, like, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. So he clearly didn't feel great about it. I haven't seen the movie. I don't plan on seeing it. I've heard a lot of really well-educated historians saying that it wasn't really an accurate depiction. It was more like a biopic of like the man himself. So I'd prefer to read a history book. But yeah, I mean, I would imagine that. I mean, I would. I wouldn't even do it. That's because UK are buying more from the USA and other countries that have put the prices up. Or hi, Mad Killer, by the way. Do you think? Well, yeah, because I mean, but isn't that such an interesting point? So here we have Russia starts a war with Ukraine. In the war with Ukraine, sanctions are placed on Russia, which completely cripples the gas industry in Europe. Therefore, Europe has to buy gas from the USA and other countries. Other countries see a market opportunity. Instead of seeing people who need help with their gasoline, instead of making a move away from gasoline and putting more effort into renewable energies, they instead jack the prices up because they see a captive market. They see a market of people that that need their oil and they can't get it anywhere else, or need their gas and they can't get it anywhere else. That's it. More resource trading, more imperial capitalism. Once again. We obviously don't know about what's going on in his head, but he actively participated in all talks and signed the thing about let's pick civilian targets. Yeah, I mean, he still did the thing. I think his regret doesn't really matter materially. I don't think it's important to give too much attention to like how he felt about it, considering the fact that he still did the thing. He still made the choice, even if he felt bad about it. He didn't feel bad enough to stop, which is the most important thing. So, excuse me. All of these countries we've talked about that are seemingly depicted as bad, and yet here we are making deals with them. Here's another thing. I'll do the last country example before I move on to something else. Here's the other thing. This is my home country. Not that I'm like, ancestrally native here. My family line only extends here for about maybe 250 years. I'm not indigenous African, but I'm also not indigenously like British or European. Because I'm a product of colonization, I don't kind of really fit anywhere. So I would say that this is my home country, but that's kind of where it ends, and I'm okay with that. It's a weird state to be in sometimes, but it's fine. This is kind of the way things are. You kind of have to accept it. This country went through a system of racial segregation, legal racial segregation, that was so intense that we, as a global majority, like the world now refers to any system of legal racial segregation as this one because it was so big. And of course, we're talking about apartheid, or apartheid if you are in the West. Apartheid was the name for the system of legal racial segregation that South Africa implemented, but there have been many types of apartheid during all of history. We are looking at one right now. We're looking at one in Israel, with the way that Israel operates within the occupied Palestinian territories that it occupies, like as of this day. The rules that exist for Palestinians are not the same as the rules that exist for Israelis. The legal systems are different. There are checkpoints for Palestinians that aren't for Israelis. They live under apartheid system. This has been already confirmed by international bodies. This is just information. It's just fact. Now, during the beginning of apartheid, the National Party, South Africa's Afrikaner white minority, who had put the country in a chokehold with its legal system of apartheid, and who had relegated, using all of their legislations and acts and things, they had evicted all indigenous Africans from the lands they were currently on and stuffed them into different territories around the country so that they forcibly displaced them, and began a genocide of that type against them. When resistance fully started officially, I wouldn't say officially because there was always resistance, but when resistance really started gaining traction and started making a difference internationally as well, things like the ANC would come up. So the African National Congress, which is now the ruling party of South Africa, but also their military wing, which is called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation. So, and the African Communist Party, I think, was also part of it. All of these political organizations, if you want to think of it in American terms, because it's easier, like think of it like the Black Panthers, for example. These sorts of political organizations tried to rise up. They were they were made up of indigenous Africans and people of mixed descent, Indian people as well. There were lots of coalitions like that, and they all tried to like band together to rise up. And they started by fighting back violently. There was of course there were of course initial, like, you know, for the last 400 years of colonization, there was, you know, attempts at peaceful resolution, but of course none of that worked. Everything failed, and after apartheid came down, they started resisting violently, which is totally justified. And when that happened, I'm getting somewhere with this, by the way. When that happened, remember that when the official apartheid, which started in 1948, when resistance to it started getting traction, it was about the 1960s. And during that time, the world was going through something called the Cold War, which we've also touched on briefly already in this discussion. I'll give you a chance to guess the National Party, the white Afrikaner minority, who they supported in the Cold War. And then I'll give you a guess as to who gave support to the South African freedom fighters, the indigenous Africans who were fighting against apartheid to end it, and who were engaging in armed resistance against the apartheid government, and who gave them support. It is who you think it is. Of course it is. In terms of like economics and stuff, the international relations were favorable towards the apartheid government of South Africa by the West, because they were capitalist, because they were favoring capitalism. And because, for two reasons, because number one, the freedom fighters of South Africa, the indigenous Africans who rose up against apartheid, were socialist, leftist, communist leaning, but secondly, they were therefore assisted by the USSR at the time and by China while they were going through their socialist reforms. What happened? These people who are fighting for their freedom, who are fighting against a system of legal racial segregation, and here you have the land of the free, home of the brave, right up here, and the original empire herself continuing to support the people who are oppressing these indigenous Africans. Because it's not about morals. It's not about good or bad. And almost as if we have a saying that says history repeats itself, here we are all over again with another system of apartheid that has been clearly shown in this teeny tiny country here. And we have the same bodies, the same international bodies supporting that same government. And except what's really interesting and actually so disheartening about this apartheid versus the apartheid that my country went through is that eventually the international pressure became so much during apartheid. The international pressure became so much for apartheid to end in South Africa that eventually the international community said, fine. And that's it. And right now, we are experiencing a full and unadulterated doubling down of support for this apartheid region than we ever saw for South Africa. It's crazy. It's actually crazy. So, yeah. To conclude with using these countries as examples, it's not about morals. It is exactly the opposite. While media will tell you it's about morals, it's actually about resources. It's about power. It's about maintaining the system that we currently have. Anything that they will spare no expense. There is no length they will not go to. There is no line that they will not cross to preserve the order that they have built, to preserve the society. And that's it. I'm going to move from this point to another one, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about this so far. Welcome, Zareth. Also, yeah, we've talked about the original empire. Like, I talk about the original colonial empire, like the global colonial empire. That's how I feel about the UK. It's not that I'm trying to, like, supplant Rome in any way. I actually don't really care that much. Like, sure, maybe Rome was the first empire, but it didn't do global colonialism, which is what we're talking about now. And I don't, I'm not trying to, like, yeah, we've talked about this already. It's fine. But welcome. I'm glad that you're here. Basically, the topic of this is that, the topic of this kind of stream thesis and discussion is that we as a world don't really, the great hypocrisy is, we work with countries that we will then market to the regular people as completely bad and wrong and backwards and awful, and then we will also trade with them and be lost without them, because the way that the world really works is by sharing things and by collaborating. And without collaborating, we are done. And yet at the same time, we're marketed as, like, there's this big division, and actually there are good guys and bad guys. Like, no. We just live on the side of the so-called good guys. I can't remember what the film said about what he thought. Sorry, I've read that already. The UK has recently set up a publicly owned renewable power company. We don't know when it's going to start trading, but there's at least something there. I'll be watching GB Energy with great interest. Okay, cool. Yeah, let us know how that works. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on. Same topic, but now talk about the way that this works. Obviously, you would think, why? How do countries do this? How did this world order get established? What did we have that made these countries the good guys of the world and made other countries that weren't part of this the bad guys of the world? The answer is the United Nations. At the end of World War II, when the United Nations was established, it was established when we think the United Nations, we think the Earth's global peace organization, like the way that peace works on Earth, and the way that we don't have world wars anymore. Instead, we just have proxy wars for the next 50 years as the USA and Russia fight each other at every turn, despite the existence of the UN. The United Nations was not built for any moral reason. The United Nations and the international legal community was not built for a moral reason. On the surface, and according to its marketing team, it may have been. But, and this is part of my degree, so it's not like I know nothing about this. The way that the legal systems work is a tenuous basis of consent. And that basis of consent is broken all the time, incredibly liberally, regardless of the so-called morals upon which the United Nations was built. The United Nations is not a moral organization. It is an organization that has a tentative balance of power sharing, and the doctrines of the United Nations are violated on a daily basis by the countries that have enough power to not worry about the consequences. See the United States of America. All the time. See the entirety of the Cold War. The entirety of the Cold War should be a case study in the failure of the United Nations, because they didn't do anything. There were decades of the Cold War where the resolutions that the UN had put in place were absolutely useless to curtail the constant vetoing of the USA and the USSR against each other. Whenever they did anything, the other power would veto, and they couldn't do anything. Here we have, from the existence of Israel from 1948 until the present, I think 80% of all of the United States' veto powers have been done in service to Israel to continue their violations of the UN Charter. Because America is not afraid of the consequences, because they were part of the countries that founded the UN. The UN was founded to preserve the power base of the countries who founded it. It was not for any moral reason. And I'm afraid that if you do think that it was for a moral reason, if you do believe it, I urge you to think more. I urge you to do more research on how many times this has been proven false, time and time and time again. The UN failed almost every country that is red right now, like even like remotely red, because it has served to prop up the countries that are mostly blue. The UN didn't have Russia as a member initially. I don't think so. Or even then, when it did, let me see. First members found it. I think Russia was a founding member, but very reluctantly. Yeah, the Soviet Union was a founder of the UN, but they were reluctant. Like the rest, the Western Europe was very reluctant to include them because of the what happened in the Russian Revolution and the reforms that were pulling the USSR up from a giant country of like peasant farmers into like a 90% literacy rate, like global superpower in a matter of 20 years. And they were like, they didn't do that with capitalism. This is a little weird. And so it was reluctant. All right. Fact that I was reminded of when talking about internment camps. Sweden had internment camps for political dissidents. Really? Specifically leftist-aligned dissidents? You know that country known for being socialist interred socialists in its history? Yeah. I mean that, yeah, absolutely. You think that the Nazi concentration camps and the Nazi like internment camps were an original idea? Brother, in 1899, from 1899 to 1902, the United Kingdom and British troops used death camps in South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War. The war crimes they committed in South Africa were absolutely insane. They are mind-boggling. The war crimes that the United States has committed before they were considered war crimes is also mind-boggling. And then afterwards as well, of course. So yeah. Why do you think that Nazi Germany went for socialists first? Like before they even went for like just, you know, the blanket Jewish person, they came for communists first. And that is mainly because Jewish people have often historically been behind a lot of leftist like thought and leftist practices. Socialists and Jews go like hand in hand a lot of the time. Historically as well. Lives in Serbia, looks outside the window. Yeah, me talking about the United Nations failing countries? Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Hey. What's up, Tygo? How's it going? I'm doing okay. United Nations was basically the main leaders of the Allies, UK, US, USSR, France, China, etc., as a redo of the League of Nations to properly prevent stuff like World War II. USSR wasn't reluctant at first, mostly became reluctant due to Truman and anti-communist mentality, Red Scare stuff, and as a result, USSR basically vetoes most things. Yes, yeah, that's a more accurate representation of the founding of the UN. Thank you, Zareth. I appreciate that. You're right. It was to it's cool to mention it was to replace the World War I United Nations, which is called the League of Nations, which was like, we should prevent another world war, and then 30 years later was like, oops. And then when the United Nations led to the Cold War, everyone was kind of like, well, we can't have another organization fail, so we'll just kind of keep them going. That part is my own conjecture. It's not real, like, historical fact, but yeah. It's also quite interesting, the perception of countries, going again to the idea of socialist Sweden living today, when we have a right-leaning government today. And this is why we make distinctions between socialist and democratic socialist and social democrat countries. The majority of the Scandinavian, the northwestern Europe, that sort of area of countries that we see as very stable, very, very developed, very like educated or whatever, those countries are social democracies. They are not socialist. They still operate under capitalist, mainly capitalist ideologies. There is still private ownership. And it's important that we get those definitions right. I turned 18 2 days ago. My dude. Happy birthday, dude. That's so cool. Yeah. If we don't call wars wars, the UN never failed, if you think about it. Yeah. Why is the Netherlands blue? So this is a map that we're using to talk about the way that countries relate to each other in this discussion. We're talking about how countries perceive each other and how we are given, basically we are told on our side that certain countries are bad when they're not, and like we talk about, we're basically deconstructing the idea of good and bad so that we can look at things more truthfully. We can get to the truth that way. And the reason that the Netherlands is blue is because it is considered an ally of all the other blue countries. This is considered the West. Like the global West is considered all of these blue countries. So this is NATO. Oh, don't get me started on NATO. NATO, ANZUS, ANPO, EU, TRA, MTP, and Partial Monroe Doctrine. So these are all of the like Western organizations that have been maintained to, in order to maintain Western. It's a word called hegemony, which basically means control or power, like a monopoly on power, basically. Yeah, the thing that I was laughing at earlier was that these countries that are like so influenced by almost everything, it's just said "hoo boy," because it's like influenced by both. I'm not sure which country this is, but that's very funny. Oh, and India, of course. India's had a lot of turmoil. Isn't it interesting that countries like India, and if this is this isn't Venezuela. It's not Cuba either. What country is this? Chile, maybe? I'm not sure. No, Chile isn't Chile like down here? Yeah, I'm not sure. Either way, it's so interesting that India, a country that has been like so heavily impacted, colonized, recolonized, influenced, and fought over by so many other countries, is one of the most like turbulent countries in the world right now. Yeah, there's some other stuff as well, like the Kurds and the Yemen fighters and the Taliban, etc. But yeah. I'm gonna head out now. I'm gonna watch my favorite show, Once Upon a Time. Oh, sick. Nice. Have fun with that. Thanks for stopping by. Is blue good or bad? We are we are trying to move away from those terms and seek what might be true within that. That's the whole point. That is fair. I think my point still kind of stands, though, in the sense of perceptions living to this day. No, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just expanding on what you said. I'm not standing at opposition to your point. I'm standing with you. It's sort of an explanation for why it is that way, why it is perceived that way, because we have diluted terms like socialist and like socialist reforms and socialist societies. We have there's a big kind of blend between social democracies and actual socialists. That is like they're not the same thing at all. But we are told that they might be similar. All right, I hear a bit bad because I'm also driving. Oh, okay, fair enough. Diving. Oh, diving. Sorry, hell diving. Yeah, my bad. Wait, no, Ecuador? Ecuador. Okay, cool. Hello, Thomas. Blue is good. You're welcome. What a lovely way to illustrate my whole point. It's nice to have you here. So, we've talked about various countries and how we have been taught to perceive them and how they really are and what's really been going on with them. We've talked about a lot of the injustices that have come about with that as well. And now, then, of course, I then move on to the United Nations and how it has failed time and time again. And the one great truth that I would like to remind you now that there are a lot more people in here, and welcome to all of the new people. I'm glad that you've stopped by for this. This has been very interesting for me. Yeah, the kind of thought that I want to remind you all with, the thought that I want to leave you with, is the thesis of all of this is that the international organizations that we have put in place are not, they are taught to us, they are marketed to us and sold to us as organizations for the force of good. They are represented as the good of the world with a capital G, that is versus the bad of the world with a capital B. And in reality, all it does is serve to enforce the current order. It serves to enforce the current structure, the current power base. That is all it is. Its founders use it as a cudgel over the countries that it considers to be bad, antithetical to its own systems, both economic, mostly economic, but also sometimes religious and obviously political as well, geopolitical, based on resources. Why do you think that almost the entirety of Africa, I don't think there are only 2 countries in the whole of the African continent that are considered part of the global East. And one of them is because they are officially part of an East, like opposition to America, when I'm talking about BRICS. The rest of Africa, and obviously South America as well, has been completely pillaged. And the international organizations that have been formed to maintain peace have been used in that extraction campaign to continue that work. And they have used the founding members, the most powerful members of the United Nations, have used those doctrines and those charters to enforce rules that apply mostly to rules that are worded in such a way that they can freely break them because they are not worried about the consequences. But the less powerful countries have to abide by them because otherwise the consequences are the more powerful countries coming down on them. So, yeah, I think I'll leave you. I haven't seen the stream up until now. I'm just spewing shit. Okay, cool. I think I'll leave this section of the conversation before I move on to the next one with a quote. In my very first year of university, I did international law, an introduction to it. And when I was introduced to it, my second year. And when I was introduced to it, the lecturer told me the main doctrine of international law, and I've never forgotten it. And it rings true even now. And it really puts into perspective the fragility of an organization like this, and how frivolously the most powerful members of the organization can, flaunt the rules in the faces of the less powerful nations. And that quote is as follows: the United Nations, the countries of the world. Let me see if I can find the quote. I'm gonna find it. Damn it! I think it was a quote that my lecturer gave me. But basically, it was. I'll try and paraphrase. Countries of international law follow almost all of the international regulations almost all of the time. In fact, it was almost all countries in the world follow almost all international laws almost all of the time. And that was used for her to then go on to describe the fact that international law runs on like a tightrope of consent. That there is really no enforcing body to enforce these laws. We all just kind of consent to them. And in the beginning, I realized, wow, that's pretty cool that all the countries are working together. And then as you get older, you realize that actually, no, it's just the most powerful countries enforcing this on the less powerful countries and enabling extraction from them and all the other things that we've already talked about. Unfortunately, consent is only afforded to those who already have a settled power base. And the consent of others is completely devalued and disrespected under the guise of rules being followed, the UN Charter being obeyed. So why am I going on about all of this stuff that's fairly depressing? That's because this is not the end of this line of thought. I've said this a few times, but it's really, really important that you understand that this is not about me telling you that the world is a shitty place. This is about us taking our time to break down what we have believed about the world so that we can get to the beautiful place that we believe the world to be. We cannot truly know the world and its potential if we do not deconstruct what has been built for us that is made up of so many lies. Deconstructing these lies and finding the truth beneath them is what helps us realize the beauty of the world, what helps us realize the beauty of its potential. When we break down all of these lines and we end up fighting for something much greater than any of this, something that truly relies on group consent, something that is collaborative, that is what we are trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do. By disseminating this information to you, I try to educate you in the direction of... I'm going to move here because I realized I've been hiding Australia this whole time. I'm trying to help us educate each other in the way of realizing the true beauty of the world, and not stopping at the deconstruction, because the deconstruction itself can be quite uncomfortable. I know that. I mean, I know how many times have you flipped on the news or flipped on social media and you've seen yet another article about what Palestinians are going through, or how the war in Ukraine is going, or what the workers in Africa are subjected to, based on like horrendous American company contracts that they've made to ensure resource extraction in Africa. Like how social issues are going on during the American election, like what's happening with the rise of fascism all across the West. When you look at all of that, it can be incredibly depressing. I urge you to use that to deconstruct your idea about what we were all taught the world was and how it worked, and find the true beauty that lies beyond all of that, and to use that as fuel for getting there. Because this is how we get there. We first have to deconstruct. We have to deconstruct in order to reconstruct. I think that's a pretty good thesis for a political stream. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. I'm going to open this fully to the floor. I have nothing more to say about this in general. If you want to speak about specifics, I'm happy to. But at this point, I think all that I've managed to say has been said. In conclusion, we deconstruct the ideas of good and bad to find the truth beneath them, because we realize that concepts of good and bad mean nothing if they are taught to us by people who do not operate on moral concepts of good and bad. Their teachings mean nothing, and therefore we must deconstruct them. I would love to hear your thoughts. If there's a specific story you'd like to go back to, if there's a specific thing that I've said that you'd like clarification on, if there's something that you'd like to share, if there is a news story you'd like to talk about today, I'm happy to be here for that. I did want to end the stream early because I do have a big day tomorrow, but I'll open to the floor now, and we'll go back here. Didn't we have this conversation before on your server, like a true Peace Corps to deal with wars and stuff? I think we did. I think that might have been one of the first learning to talk topics that I came up with. I think, yeah, we were talking about, like, how do we... Someone asked a question. Maybe it was me. How do we deal, because we talk about how the UN works on consent, what if it didn't work on consent? What if there was an enforcement body? I can't remember who asked the question. What do you guys think about that? What do you think about the option of a world police or a Peace Corps to be called into action with wars? I can see a problem with it, but I'll wait for people to give their thoughts first. I guess as an example for international law, there was an order for Putin's arrest some time ago, and since then he traveled to multiple countries who were supposed to enforce that order, but here we are. Including mine. Including mine. He traveled to South Africa and we didn't arrest him. Because we're part of BRICS, like we're part of the same coalition. And it's like, okay, so why do we have the law then? Like, why does the law exist? And also, like, why are arrest warrants only sent out for those red countries that we mentioned? Why don't we have arrest warrants for all of the war crimes that American presidents have done in their presidency? Why? I mean, we've talked about why. Netanyahu has an arrest out for him and he's spoken in the US Congress since then. Yeah, dude. Exactly. Several countries are wanting to try him in The Hague as a war criminal. There are protests in throughout Israel from some people who specifically want him gone. Now, of course, Netanyahu is not the sole reason for, whatever Israel is doing. Netanyahu is just the figurehead for everything. He's not a good guy, trust me. And of course, I say good in that blanket term that I talked about before. But it is really about the environment. It is really about the inception of that whole region. It's the creation of that country that has led to everything here. But yeah, imagine if we had imagine if Hitler came to speak in one of the Western countries about his sort of plans to sort of restructure Germany and get rid of the undesirable people, and he framed it like Netanyahu did, because one thing that Hitler did in his eventually his public face was also extermination. But Netanyahu is really doing his best to market, we're just asking them nicely to leave. Imagine if Hitler was doing that. Okay, so regarding the topic earlier of a Peace Corps, here we go. We would definitely need an enforced global police, Peace Corps, best equipment, purely volunteer forces from multiple countries, soldiers to be retired after each tour, so there's no time to influence. Right. So, yeah, I mean, we're not going to solve this. Okay, so from the beginning, I'm going to say we're not going to solve this problem and figure out a solution for this in one stream. So this is just kind of exploring ideas. Who gets to decide? Like, what countries get to decide? Who gets to decide what countries the Peace Corps go into? Is it any war that breaks out ever? What if the war is actually revolution? What if it's what if it's armed resistance against an oppressive state? What if it is freedom fighters? What if it's slaves uprising against slavers? What if it's is it any conflict? Do we decide on a case-by-case basis? Who decides? What countries are a part of that? Who's the member states? Who are the permanent member states? Who are the most powerful permanent member states? Who can veto things? Because I'm telling you now, it doesn't matter how, cooperative and peace-loving the enforcers are in the organization. Who orders them around is going to require, anyway, a complete restructuring and a completely different organization from the UN. Because the way the UN works now, I'll tell you, I can go back to that map and I'll point to countries that Peace Corps is going to be sent into. and they won't deserve that, So that's my big glaring issue with it. My second issue is going to the very heart of the idea of enforcement, of law enforcement. But that's a little bit more, that's a slightly different topic, because the way that I see enforcement is completely different. I don't view the world that I want to live in is a world that does not have police as we imagine them to be. People who rule by who rule by, you know, like threats of intervention and violence and things, which is how most police forces operate all over the world. Brother, I need more than 160 characters. Oh no, I know. Don't worry. I'm not saying like I'm not using it to criticize what you're saying. I have the benefit here, of course, as the person who's not limited by 160 characters. I hate YouTube's comment section 100%. The chat of YouTube is incredibly limiting. Feel free to like number your chats. Like if you're gonna chat, do like 1 out of question mark and then 2 out of and then 3 out of, etc. I'd love to read it that way, because then you can type more freely. You don't have to fit your whole take into 160 characters. I would never expect that. Like I don't want people to think that I'm like I expect you to formulate your point, your very nuanced point about a United Nations Global Peace Corps in like one YouTube comment. You can use as many as you like. But also, I just wanted to let you know, there is a Peace Corps. Like, there are peacekeepers. And interestingly, mostly made up of Irish peacekeepers. They're currently stationed on the border between Lebanon and Israel. and Israel is telling them to get out of the way. And they're killing them. Let me see here. UN peacekeepers. Many have already died. Yes, the United Nations Interim Force, UNIFIL, is a United Nations peacekeeper mission established on 19 March 1978, established by the United Nations Security Council. They're a peacekeeping force. So they do have peacekeepers. And the UNIFIL was sent, they were sent to, what's crazy is that they were created to confirm Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon the first time they invaded in 1978. And here they are being sent again, now in 2024, because Israel is doing it again. Why does anyone get to veto? Hello, Akil. What do you mean? Do you think that no one should be able to veto it? Like that, that the power of veto should be completely abolished? Because I'm not going to lie, I kind of like that. I think the power of veto throughout the United Nations history has done way more harm than good. It has only ever been used by the most powerful countries to stop decisions from being made that could possibly have changed material conditions for a lot of people. I've just mentioned that America has used a vast majority of its powers of veto to protect Israel from continuing to disobey its mandate, its UN mandate. And during the Cold War, almost all of the powers of veto were used from America against Russia again and again and again and again to keep themselves from doing anything ideologically different. And nothing, it got so bad, I studied this, it got so bad that, like, I think for a whole, like, decade period during the Cold War, nothing was done. Like, no decisions were made. The UN was, like, stagnant. Because the USSR and the USA kept, like, vetoing each other. Wasn't veto used literally just as a means to make sure the big powers would join the UN? That is a great point. Why was the power of veto created in the UN? Okay. So oh, I read this actually. I read this. Okay, so justifications for the veto are usually based. Let me read this here. Let me go into screen sharing. And I'll put this screen up so we can look at it. So this is Wikipedia. So this is like an introduction. So if you want to learn more about this, you can read deeper into the resources they provide. Yes, I think no one should be able to veto. Yeah, I would be on board with that 100%. The USA, USSR, China, etc. would not join if they weren't given the power to veto. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, if that wasn't the purpose, it was certainly the result. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, the purpose, I don't think, like, intent versus impact, right? Intent doesn't matter at all when it comes to the impact that it's having. And the power of veto has been used time and time again to do exactly that, just to maintain those power structures. I feel we need to have a list of guidelines that should be enforceable per country. No slavery, no invading a sovereign nation. If in a civil war, then no war crimes, no genocide, so on. Peace Corps should be used for maintaining those guidelines. That sounds like a fair... That sounds like a fair kind of guideline to have. Remember, that is the UN Charter, though. Like, the UN Charter does say that in all of its guidelines. We have a document for genocide. And yet we've had a genocide for a year now in a country. Like, it... So there needs to be more, right? And I think that your ideas and the ideas that led to the creation of the UN Charter fall apart because of who is in power. It falls apart because of who's making the rules and who gets to enforce them and who gets to choose when to enforce them and when not to. And the problem is that the countries that have put themselves at the top of the food chain are too powerful for any other countries to make enough of a difference. That is why those rules will never be enforced to the full extent of how they should be. Otherwise, there would be... I can't count the number of UN resolutions that the United States of America is in violation of today. Like, today. The number of sovereign territories that they violate on a daily basis with their 800 military bases situated around the world in other sovereign countries. Like, if the rules don't, like, the rules don't apply to them because they made the rules, you know? They're the ones that are powerful enough to enforce them. So the rules are not the problem. And I'm not saying things like the rules are not the problem, it's the application of the rules, because within those rules gives America that kind of power to do whatever it wants. So the rules need to be completely scrapped and rethought again. Okay, here we go. So this is about the power of veto. There's criticism, which we'll look at in a second, but justifications for the veto are usually based in the interests of the permanent members and the idea that peace and security is only possible if the great powers are all working together. The great powers obviously being the big five, like Russia, China, United States, etc. These are sourced. At the San Francisco conference, arguments presented by the permanent members included that the veto power was a reflection of political realities. So in other words, this is just the way things are. We are just that powerful, so therefore we should have more power than other countries. As if that makes sense. That the United Nations would break down if it attempted to carry out enforcement actions against a permanent member. What? So if a permanent member, like the United States, commits a war crime that requires United Nations intervention, then the United States should have veto power, because if they don't, then the United Nations would break down because they'd be going after a permanent member for breaking the United Nations charters. Like, huh? This is such a strange argument. That it prevented the Security Council from making a decision that could harm relations between the permanent members. Okay, yeah. And that their privileged status was linked to a responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. I would really hope that that in our discussions before, simply with my brief like talks about how history has worked with other countries, that the concept of international peace and security means completely jack shit in so many places in the world. There is no international peace and security. That's crazy. Their privileged status. Holy shit, dude. According to one author, there were 4 reasons evident at the conference. Number 1, unanimity was considered indispensable for peace. Okay. permanent members needed to protect their national interests. I mean, it's there for you. Like, it's in the words. They're genuinely just... Ugh. Number 3, the need to protect minority blocs from over-dominating majority coalitions. What? But majority coalition, like... That's already happening, though. Like, that happens because of the veto power. Very weird. And the desire to prevent rash Security Council resolutions. Oh, yeah, and through this, by the way, Security Council resolutions take years to form. And so a hell of a lot of nothing happens a lot of the time. In 1993, Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans wrote that the veto was established to ensure that the United Nations did not commit to things it would be unable to follow through due to great power opposition. Supporters regard the veto as an important safeguard in international relations. Thomas G. Weiss and Giovanna Quelle called it a variation on the Hippocratic Oath. UN decisions should do no harm. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the profound wisdom of the founders of the United Nations, referring to the veto power as the underpinning of international stability. Stability is not peace. Stability is not justice. Stability is the status quo. Stability is maintenance of the current power structure. It is not justice, it's not peace, it's not progress. Stability, as he is talking about it, is stagnation and allowing countries to make things worse under the guise of using a veto to prevent huge moves. Because that's what it would take to stop these things from happening. God, that's crazy. That is a crazy thing to say. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi lauded its important role in checking the instinct of war. So, like, sure, but it hasn't done that. We've had wars from then till now. Incredibly destructive ones. Countries have been destabilized permanently, like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Palestine, South Korea, North Korea. Hello? Like, they've been destabilized because of war. This has failed. It's crazy. Then they should be separated from countries. No influence from any country. It's something to benefit everyone so no one gets influenced, such as why cycle troops every tour. How it is decided where troops are sent is X guideline being broke? Yes, send the Peace Corps. But troops are still parts of countries. Who decides if X guideline is being broken? Troops for the Peace Corps are volunteers, freshly trained for one tour, then retired to home, so home country gets no influence. As for decision, have a council of random representatives, not world leaders. And if even one says that a guideline is being broke, send the Peace Corps to investigate at minimum. It's a pretty cool idea. I noticed that a lot of the things that you're saying are already happening. And the problems are bigger than that. So if the problems are still happening, something different must be necessary, right? Like, obviously the troops for the United Nations Peace Corps might not be like only there for like one tour, for example. But I think it must be that there needs to be a deeper, more systemic change if we're going to see more permanent results. The way that countries talk to each other, the way that the United Nations currently works is not sustainable. I fear that any solutions without complete restructuring is going to act as simply a band-aid. As good as the ideas might be. Yeah. Anyway, let's end things off with some criticism of the veto power. The veto power has been criticized for its controversial nature. A single country can prevent a majority of the Security Council from taking any action. This is why Israel has been continuing to do what it does, by the way. Like, the veto power is almost singularly responsible for that. For example, the United States routinely casts lone vetoes of resolution criticizing Israel. Correct. The permanent members also veto resolutions that criticize their own actions. In 2014, Russia vetoed a resolution condemning its annexation of Crimea. Exactly. The power of veto is almost singularly responsible for not only the continuation of the war in Ukraine, but also the continuation of the genocide in Palestine. Now, there are obviously other things that are responsible as well. But the power of veto has made an almost irreparable dent in the quality of our sort of world order, for lack of a better word. Amnesty International claimed that the 5 permanent members had used their veto to promote their political self-interest or geopolitical interest above the interest of protecting civilians. I mean, this is just a fact. This is just true. Some critics see veto power exclusive to the permanent 5 as being anachronistic, unjust, or counterproductive. Peter Naden writes that the veto is an anachronism. In the 21st century, the veto has come to be almost universally seen as a disproportionate power and an impediment to credible international action to crises. And this, my friends, is because the veto power in its nascence, in its birth, was used to consolidate power. It was used to make the powerful permanent members more powerful. They escaped consequence, and they grew more powerful until now. Here we are in the 21st century where they are just magically above all, accountability. They've made it that way. They did it on purpose. This is why this is different. Improvement on the UN Peace Corps because that is faulted for being part of the UN. Yeah. I like listening to your thoughts, Zareth. I think it's interesting. The enormous influence of the veto power has been cited as a cause of the UN's ineffectiveness in preventing and responding to genocide, violence, and human rights violations. Yes. Various countries outside the permanent members, such as the Non-Aligned Movement and the African Union, have proposed limitations on the veto power. Yes. Reform of the veto power is often included in proposals for reforming the Security Council. Yes. I think you should just take it away entirely. I can't see a single justification for having the veto power now, in 2024. I could see ones earlier. I can no longer see a reason for it. The veto has been used to protect allies of the permanent members and to prevent or stall UN peacekeeping or peace enforcement operations. The threat of using a veto, also called a hidden or pocket veto, may still have an effect even if a veto is not actually cast. In 1994, the United States and France both threatened vetoes regarding the Rwandan genocide, which prevented the UN from undertaking an effective intervention, while in 1998 to 99, Russia and China threatened vetoes to prevent UN intervention against the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, and again in 2004 to prevent intervention in the Darfur genocide. And here we are again with Palestine. Is this not enough? Is this not enough to show you that it should go? Is this not enough evidence? To me, this is enough. It's so weird how they can veto a proposal to change how veto works. And that is another thing. I was actually going to mention this. Reforming the Security Council. Proposals for reforming the Security Council. If in a proposal to reform how the Security Council works, if inside that proposal is a power to change the power of veto, that proposal can also be vetoed. So what do you do? What do you do? In light of the criticisms of veto power and its impact on the decision-making process of the United Nations Security Council, several reform proposals have emerged. Among these, the Noble World Foundation has presented an innovative approach. It proposes that membership and veto power be shifted from individual states to sovereignty pooling organizations like the European Union. This proposal aligns with the UNSC's established practice of selecting non-permanent members based on regional representation. The goal of this proposal is to improve the effectiveness and decision-making capabilities of the UNSC. The EU's model of pooled sovereignty, which was strengthened by a 1964 decision from the European Court of Justice affirming the superiority of EU law over the national laws of member states, supports the idea that regional organizations like the EU can qualify for UN membership. The NWF suggests that regional organizations like the EU could be eligible for UN membership, a reform achievable without requiring amendments to the UN Charter. By seeing the EU as a national sovereign body, a pooled sovereign organization, the EU could theoretically become a member of the UN. And therefore we could change the right of veto to be from just one country to a whole collection of countries needing to veto something for it to be fully prevented. I think this is a band-aid solution, and I think that the true solution is to simply do away with the power of veto entirely. But of course, the way that the international order currently works is they will oppose any form of radical restructuring, and they will simply say no. And the only thing we have left is armed resistance or violent revolution. And so, unfortunately, slow reforms and band-aid solutions are often the only things that are even considered when it comes to structural change to international law. Based off of the wiki article, it's fun to see that a lot of the support for veto comes from the veto holders themselves, while all of the criticism comes from pretty much everyone else. Isn't that an interesting point? Isn't it crazy that the people who have the power of veto are the ones who think the power of veto is good and protected and should be upheld and maintained? Isn't it crazy that every other country has a problem with the power of veto because it is routinely used against them? Such a weird coincidence. Hello, Alfred. You're here just at the end. Yes. So, as I've said in conclusion, I think we'll come to the end of the stream now. Get your final thoughts in if you have any. But as the kind of information that I'm here to disseminate to you today, when we discuss international law and international geopolitics, I hope that you have that your takeaway has been, if you haven't done so already, at least the beginning of deconstruction of the ideas of good and bad. Realize that we have been educated a certain way for someone and against someone else, and understand that when it comes to maintaining the current geopolitical order, that countries are not doing good or bad things. They market themselves to the populations that are part of their constituency as being good. But morals do not arrive in their heads and at their discussing tables when they come to decisions regarding the international community. Morals are only the considerations they make when they try to sell us on decisions that they make. The international community that we have today has been forged, maintained, and exists currently as a way to protect the most powerful players in the world and to keep them in power over and against the other nations in the world so that they can continue to exploit them. And right now, the UN mostly works to serve the imperial capitalist core of the United States and Western Europe, because the vast majority of UN countries support that vibe, to support that environment as well. While Russia and China continue to be members of the United Nations, and while the power of veto keeps a lot of that from happening, we still live in that core. And therefore, it is our responsibility to critique that, to look beneath it, to realize when we are being sold something. When we allow our representatives to do things under the guise of one moral superiority, when in actual fact it is merely to protect resources, to secure interests, or sometimes simply to oppress people. And finally, this deconstruction that we have done, these case studies of different countries, the goal of this deconstruction is not simply to lay bare the fragile foundations of our world. It is not simply to show you how many really bad countries there actually are, and how the fact that countries are never heroes, but in fact people can be heroes. That it is not merely, the point of this is not merely to show this reality that can often be very depressing, to show these lies that have shown to happen, these systems that don't work. The point of this is to look through. Let that deconstruction be the fuel for you to continue imagining what a world that is truly beautiful could look like. A world that takes what is currently here and turns it into something that we can really be proud of. It starts with discussions like this. The deconstruction and the disillusionment that happens as a natural result of the deconstruction, that can leave someone feeling very hopeless and very depressed, is only the first step. I urge you to look at the true point of this conversation, which is to find an ideal end point that we can get to and learn to use this deconstruction to strive for that end point. Note that we will never get there, but if we aim there and get close, I'd say that's good enough. A world like Super Earth. Bum, 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 bum. On that note, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining me here. I'd like to thank you all so much for your inputs and your discussions, your thoughts, and your considerations for what I've said and for what everyone else has been saying. Thank you everyone for communicating with each other here in chat and for putting forward your ideas. I really love learning and listening to the way that you think about the world. I love hearing the kinds of solutions that you think of. I love hearing the way that you analyze problems. And I love sharing in this knowledge with you, so thank you. I do feel like these are some of my most fulfilling streams that I do, because I really get to talk about what I feel is important to me. And I hope that you are getting to talk about what is important to you. So thank you. That will round out our streams for the week. As with all political streams, I think I'll end off on some of this more chilled music, because I think it's more appropriate. I really appreciate this talk and this whole stream. Thank you for tuning in. And no matter how you've engaged with this content, whether you've been lurking or whether you've been watching the VOD in the future, thank you. And I wish you a happy rest of the weekend. If you have any more thoughts regarding this, please feel free to put it in the Discord. I'll be happy to respond to it. And I will see you next week. New week, new streams. I don't know what we're going to do yet. I'll figure it out. Check the stream schedule. It'll be posted up on Monday. And I'll see you in the next stream, where you do it all over again. Stay hydrated and be kinder to yourself than you're currently being. Take care.